Tēnā koutou katoa e te iwi. It's Bernard Hickey here. I'm the co-host of The Hoon, talking to you from an island in the Hauraki Gulf, while Peter is in Hoon Bay. Peter Bale, co-host of The Hoon. How are
It's
you?
so good to see. And well, I assume since you've got broadband that you're not on Rakino, because I've been wondering about getting a batch on Rakino, and everywhere I go, people say you can't go to bloody Rakino. There's no power. And then I think, well, that might be just perfect actually.
Yeah.
But how is it going over there? Now, look, I reckon that so you've got those lovely palms would call Kentia palms. But I think well, I'm going to have to bring him over to do a botanical check on your beautiful palms.
Yeah, they do look lovely. And I'm really enjoying the bird life. You'll probably hear some bird life, and maybe if I'm really lucky, a kaka will swoop through the background,
Yeah,
making
I've
the
mainly
most.
seen carcas in that place that you were going to buy a place in, and the sort of south of Waiheke down towards where John Spencer, the toilet paper billionaire, had his place. Um,
Y- yeah,
but
no,
that's
I'm,
where I've
I'm
seen
very,
kaka before.
yeah, and I'm very lucky. We're at a place where there's an awful lot of traffic in the mornings and evenings,
On
where
your
they're
little
going
road, when you
from.
say an awful lot, I've walked down your road. You mean there's like 6 cars every hour?
No, no. When I say traffic, traffic of kaka.
Oh, traffic. I said, yeah, yeah. I was going to say that
So
silly.
going from one chunk of bush to another chunk of bush, they often do it in the morning and the evening. In Wellington, you see it between Zealandia and Mount Victoria,
Yeah,
and here there's a couple of bits of bush. So if we're really lucky, sometime between 5 and 6 o'clock, a series of kaka will go through the
cool,
background screeching.
excellent. Let's be, let's be like having Josie on,
That's way too mean and nasty, and not the sort of thing that
and completely
that we.
untrue, and completely
Yeah,
untrue. Now, Bernard, what are we
absolutely.
going to deal with today? Because I don't know. I felt exhausted last week when we did the last one on the Friday, and then when I say exhausted, I felt sort of psychically exhausted by trying to nut out what was going on in Israel and against Hamas and so on. And I feel even more that tonight. And the weird thing is, of course, the part of my psychic exhaustion of it is that I'm in New Zealand when I ought to be in London or Jerusalem working on this story. So we'll talk about that. What else are we going to talk about today?
So we've got obviously the election results and the fallout from that. We're going to be talking to Catherine Dyer at shortly about what's happening with the climate. We've got the big new paper out of Nature on what's happening with the Greenland ice shelf. More calls in Europe to ban cruise ships, and we'll talk about methane,
Yeah, good
big
luck
issue
with
for
that.
farmers here.
Yep, yep.
And then of course we have Rob Patman on, and I hope, Peter, we're able to talk about some of the background to the awful conflict
Yeah,
in
just because
Gaza.
I sent out, I think in that thing that you put, we cross posted in Substacks, because we sort of basically scratch each other's back. But um, Rory Stewart from the Rest is Politics podcast did a very good sort of summation of why we've got where we are. So I thought I've written one, but I thought I'd asked our audience, would you like me just before we do Robert Patman, and Robert will be there to do maybe 60 to 90 seconds on my take on how we got to where we are. Is that
Yeah,
because
no, I'd
what I
certainly be
find? I mean,
interested.
if not that we have any listeners who are under 30, but or possibly under 45, but it's a really interesting problem about knowing the names, knowing the periods, knowing when these things happened, because for me. The end of the Ottoman Empire is basically a news story in the Herald sitting on my father's lap.
Yeah, and it's those pieces of history, the background, the nuance that
Oh,
often gives you a sense of where, not where things might go, but at least why things
yeah,
might be
good.
happening.
Danny, who says I'm under 45, that's fantastic. And Dara, who I thought was a chap and is a woman, turns out to be a woman. She's the one who accused me of talking piffle. So but top quality piffle, as I responded to her. So I will try to do this in a eventually in a non-sexist, non-Semitic way, non-anti-Semitic way, certainly. Anyway, Catherine, it's getting a little warm in here, isn't it?
Sure is. Yeah.
I mean, in the world, make sure you got your microphone right in it, because you just sounded very quiet then. Um,
I'm a
It's
very
it's
quiet
getting rather
person.
warm in the world. Do you want to,
It is.
including we're going to get Greenland is going to be green rather than white. It looks.
Well, yes, it is looking a bit that way. There was an article out in Nature this week.
Bring the microphone closer to your face,
Even
please,
closer?
Don.
Yeah, yeah, no, that'd be
like
great.
literally, swallow it, as it were. I don't mean to be rude, but
I don't think I can get it much closer than that. How's
Yeah.
that sounding?
That sounds great.
good. Thank you.
Okay, super. So you want to hear about this article about the Greenland ice sheets melting? So at the moment, they're saying in this article that there are some signs or precursory signals of what they call an impending critical transition, which is essentially saying they're approaching a tipping point, and they're estimating that that tipping point will be reached when the global mean temperature reaches somewhere
Catherine,
between.
can we just check? Is your microphone actually turned on? Have you tried doing Control Alt Delete? Have you tried actually putting it? I think there might be a problem with actual power to your microphone.
Let me
Is that
just
possible?
saying it's on?
Yeah.
we're using. I'll just.
Sorry.
Yep. No, the issue there, I think, is we're using the MacBook Air microphone.
Yeah, it's coming
connection.
through. It's coming through your Mac rather than through your microphone. But let's carry on because we can. The audience is saying, "For Christ's sake, will you just get on with us?" We've only got an hour because then we have to flick over to Television New Zealand at 6:00 to find out what's happening in the rugby.
Yep. So
Go ahead, Catherine. Sorry,
yeah,
Yes.
we can. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so the Greenland ice sheets, they're saying that they're approaching a tipping point when the global mean temperature gets somewhere between 1.7 and 2.3 degrees Celsius, which is not potentially too far off. If they were to collapse altogether, that's something like 7 meters of sea level rise eventually, but that happens over a couple of hundred years or a few hundred years. And they're also saying, and this is the good news, is that if you overshoot those temperatures and then you manage to drag it back somehow by storing, capturing carbon dioxide and storing it underground, then you can stop that whole transition to a new state of the ice sheet from happening. You would still get a few meters of sea level rise, but you could stop it from going all the way. But that, of course, depends on can you capture carbon dioxide and store it underground. And another point I would add on to that is in the IPCC's pathways, the social, the political, economic pathways that they have, the different pathways for going out into the future. All of those pathways that keep us below 2 degrees of warming by 2100, they all have some form of overshoot, and then we pull it back by storing stuff underground. So that's the current assumptions in a lot of our modelling, which some people call into question because at the moment we don't have any scaled up way that we know we can do that.
So
and maybe we never will.
So essentially, all of our current official plans rely on us effectively coming from behind in the second half to win.
which
And,
we're quite good at, Bernard,
Well,
Just
as
the
we might
plans
see
that-
on Saturday night or whenever it is.
yeah.
Just the planes that keep us under 2 degrees.
Yeah,
of all-
and that's the problem here because this paper, as more and more research is saying, is showing that the tipping points seem to be quite close to 1.5 degrees, closer than maybe we thought previously. And so the whole idea of keeping warming under 1.5 degrees is to stay clear of these tipping points. If we now know that the tipping points might be closer to 1.5 degrees, and this one suggests somewhere between 1.7 and 2.3, then we're playing with fire, so to speak, and sadly,
And ice.
and ice, fire and ice, and in Canada, that was a very bad segue and pun. I know. I'm sorry, but this is the problem. We're essentially
We have
getting
to laugh
behind.
as we go.
Yeah, we're getting behind, and we're getting closer to losing. I do worry a bit about that. The other thing that I thought was interesting this week, Catherine, and this is a bit of a preview to something that we'll have on the Kaka next week, is you've had a look at the debate around methane and farming in New Zealand, and in particular some comments around whether or not our farms are producing methane that further warms the planet, and some debate between people who've watched this closely. Can you give us a bit of a sneak preview?
Yeah, so in the last week I've spoken to Professor David Frame and also to Simon Upton, who's the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. And what I'm trying to do there, and what we'll be putting out sometime next week, hopefully, is to try and divide out what does the science say and what are the decisions that are just based on your values or your political beliefs or what you think ought to happen going forward. And there's been a bit of confusion between those two things. You know, what does the science actually tell us, and what does our decision making based on, you know, what we say we want to achieve long term, and what we commit to the rest of the world that we're going to do. Where does our political decision making come into that? So that's the bit that we're going to try and unwind and you know, make it clearer for people so that they can have a better informed choice in that debate.
Will they have a choice, though, Catherine, do you think? I just also answer one question which one of our audience, Catherine Rowan, asked, and I think I know the answer to this, but it was the difference between, or the importance of methane. My recollection is that methane is a relatively short-lived but high-impact gas. Is that right?
Yeah, it behaves very differently to CO2. So there's some estimations that up until today that methane has contributed some 40% of warming to today's temperatures. Okay, so historically it's contributed 40%. The thing with methane, though, is that it has a huge warming impact, but it doesn't last in the atmosphere for very long. It kind of starts to degrade. It peaks about 12 years, degrades, or half of it's degraded after 12 years, and then it slowly disappears after that. But it does have some long-term warming effects, which can be modelled. And there's some sort of new scientific, well, not completely new, but there have been some developments in terms of how we measure short-term gases versus how we measure long-term gases. And I think the important
Bernard was about to start smoking then, but carry on.
I think that there is, you know, there are very good reasons for treating the two differently. And there are very good reasons for trying to understand what impact they have and how you need to manage them going forward differently. So that's the stuff that we really kind of want to.
Well, thank God we've elected, Winston Peters, the climate denialist, to help us sort these problems out. No worries.
Yeah.
And probably, okay, my prediction: Winston Peters will be foreign minister, and he's going to have to go to all the COP20 conferences to try and negotiate New Zealand's future carbon thing.
Well, the foreign minister doesn't usually do that.
He will.
Wow. Yeah. No, this is an interesting point, though. In a world where climate change negotiations will be one of the big things we have to do, and from a local regional point of view, and Winston Peters can claim some credit for our Pacific reset starting in 2018. For the Pacific, it's all about climate change. So having a climate change, we're not denying, but skeptic foreign minister, or at least that's what he said during the election campaign, is not going to be fantastic. But I agree with you, Peter. I think there's a high chance that there's a high chance that National will put Winston into that position, as much to get him out of the country.
Absolutely. And also, he's so pompous that it will suit him perfectly. And actually, like we've said before, he wasn't bad. Catherine, one of our listeners, Alistair Shawn, says that it's an excellent idea that you've had, in a sense, or a proposal to quantify the difference between reality and political pie in the sky ideas. I think that's another solutions journalism thing for the Hickey Catherine Dyer axis. You don't generally do some data journalism, but maybe we could do some data journalism around that. That a regular Kaka tracker you could do.
A Kaka tracker of
methane, of the ideas relative to the reality, just like a reality check thing going on. could be quite interesting.
Yeah, well, I have to say we got some fantastic graphs today from Simon Upton from PCE, which we will definitely be linking to because they make the picture quite clear, I think.
Yeah, no, that is. I can't tell you how excited I am about those charts, and we're
Yeah,
looking
me
forward
too.
to seeing them next week. Just finally, Catherine, news on the cruise ship front, where Europe is increasingly looking to ban these things from turning up in their harbours. One of the Dutch ports has said no. What do we know now about these cruise ships and how much of a factor they are in climate change?
Yeah, there was a really interesting article in The Guardian about this today. And so, what they were saying is that in Europe, there are some 218 cruise ships circling around Europe. And those 218 cruise ships emit more than 14 times more sulfur oxides than the entire continent's cars combined. So, all of the cars on the European continent. And sulfur dioxide, of course, is a really terrible pollutant. It's not just that it's a greenhouse gas; it also is linked to cancer and cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses. Pollution in general is responsible for something like 1 in 10 deaths internationally each year, and so the healthcare costs associated
Yeah,
with that are
and that's even
enormous.
before we start with norovirus on the cruise ships.
That's right, and
Yeah.
also bear in mind that these cruise ship companies don't actually pay a lot of tax in terms of helping to solve those
Well, they're
problems because
offshore.
they're all registered offshore. Yeah, so they're creating a lot of externalities just
Yeah.
in climate emissions and in healthcare. Um, to
Yeah, but
remediate some of
where
the
else would
damage
we
that's
send
been
our old
done.
people when we're sick of them,
Well, this
other
is
than on a
the
cruise?
this is an interesting point though, because we have this. Well, I have this vague idea that somehow cruise ships are not quite as damaging as people jumping on planes. But when you look at
What?
how people actually do cruising, often they jump on a plane to go on the cruise, and also once they're cruising, they're using an awful lot of resources on the ship, and as we discover, the the ships actually dock, and then they run their engines while the whole caboodle are sitting there, so that they can cook their four course meals, and
And the electricity. Yeah.
and generate electricity for the
God,
whole
the
cruise ship.
socialism. Just
It's not socialism.
I
It's
really wanted to do one day the Concorde flight to New York, and then the trip back on the QE2 with Cunard. I just thought that would
that
be
was a deal.
so cool. That was
Yeah,
that was that was before I became an environmentalist socialist. But
yeah.
wouldn't that have been cool?
It would have been cool, except really hot, and that's the
Yeah.
problem in the long run. And
I've 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 kind of said for a long time that if you live downtown near to the port, you should be aware of that. That's a lot of pollution that comes from those ships just sitting there, in the port. And particularly if you have young kids or babies, I don't know that I would want to be living in an
The
apartment
good thing is none of those
downtown near
ships
the
come
port
to
for that
Dunedin
reason.
because Dunedin is a sort of scary hellhole. Do cruise? Here's Robert.
great
The cruise ship.
segue. Thank you very much,
We're
Catherine.
just shitting on the entire
Thanks,
cruise ship
thanks, Bernard.
industry, but I believe Robert that there is in fact, because my former partner took it, a cruise ship that goes from, I think, Dunedin around to Fiordland, which in her case was an incredible sort of floating COVID hotspot. But
Oh.
it does sound like a rather wonderful trip. But we've just shat on the entire cruise ship industry. Have you done a cruise? You're too young
No,
to
I
have a
haven't.
cruise, I
No,
think.
fortunately.
Now look, welcome.
Sometimes one of the things
Good
about
afternoon. How are you doing?
There you go.
Good.
One of the things about cruise ships is sometimes that they have specialist trips for. Often they'll have cruise ships where experts do talks, and you occasionally have these cruise ships where they have
Financial
academics,
journalists from New
journalists
Zealand,
doing talks on
professors of
cruise ships.
international affairs,
Yeah, yeah.
Waiting
No,
to be
shitters from Hoon
invited.
Bay.
yeah. No, so we'll try and avoid that. Lovely to see you, Robert. What I'm
Good to see
hoping
you.
to hear this week from yourself and from Peter is to get an understanding about what is going on in Gaza, what might happen next. And Peter, you've written an excellent piece for the
Well,
spin-off that went out yesterday about it, and I'd love to hear a bit more from yourself and from Robert about the background to this conflict in Gaza.
Yeah, so Robert, after having said how wonderful Rory Stewart's thing was on The Rest is Politics, I wrote one which is asking for gigantic trouble. May I read you and the audience something that I wrote today? I'm not going to do it all, and I'm going to try and skip a little bit. But this is Israel from the late 19th century. Okay, and I have a particular friend who's probably going to come around a little bit later and throw a grenade through my house. Okay, Zionist ideas gathered pace in the late 19th century with a couple of different streams. One was devoted to the idea of a shared state with Arabs. Another, strongly the view that Israel could not be shared and must be militarized. Britain gained Palestine as a League of Nations mandate after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 supported the creation of a Jewish homeland in the former Ottoman territories of the Holy Land. And it's also, that declaration, particularly at the end of the First World War, is one of the origins of some of the anti-Semitic tropes around the Rothschilds. Britain struggled to contain Zionist terror groups right up to World War II. Many thousands of Jews joined the Zionist movement, fleeing post-World War II Europe and the Holocaust experience to insist on the creation of a Jewish state. Exodus, the Leon Uris book, and the movie were incredibly powerful, that whole plucky Israel post-World War II phenomenon. Israel was recognized in 1948, I understand first by Stalin, partly in an attempt to piss off the Americans. And this is Stalin who also thought of a Jewish homeland in Crimea and Uganda. The Nakba followed fairly soon after the creation of Israel, which is the chaos and terror of, as Arabs see it, of being forced out to some extent from areas claimed by Zionist Israelis. And they were also urged by the surrounding Arab powers to leave. So they were kind of in a bit of a bind there. And that's also where you get this idea, which I stepped into today rather foolishly, that Zionism is somehow inherently colonial and has a connection to New Zealand and the tangata whenua in New Zealand. Of course, the difficulty is that both Palestinians and Jews are arguably indigenous to the country. Then in the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, more or less where the plucky Israel narrative starts, as Israel staged a preemptive attack, particularly against the Egyptian Air Force, destroying virtually all of it on the ground. It gained what is now Gaza and the Sinai Desert and the Golan Heights overlooking the Israeli border with Syria. Perhaps most lastingly, Israel took Jerusalem, which is, of course, the second holiest place in Islam and the holiest place to Jews and to Christians. The UN declarations which Israel defies are all about going back to the pre-1967 borders. Taking over what is now the West Bank occupied territories drove more Palestinians into Jordan, dramatically changing the political and demographic balance in the kingdom. It also left a legacy of refugee camps in Lebanon, of which more later. In 1973, Arab states staged their own preemptive strike against Israel, surprising the military and Golda Meir, the Prime Minister, much as the October 7 strike did last week, or earlier this month. Israel ultimately fought back and triumphed, and a new hardline phase began to prevent Israel ever again being overrun by its neighbours, hostile neighbours. In the years since, Israel has become a porcupine, dangerous to threaten, and it's become an undeclared nuclear power. Kippur conflict 50 years ago. Since then, we've had periodic conflicts, strikes into Syria, decades of terror attacks by the Palestinian Liberation Organization led by Yasser Arafat. In 1978, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli PM Menachem Begin, previously branded a terrorist by the British during their period of occupation and a leader of the Stern Gang terror group under the British mandate in the 1930s and 40s, Begin signed the Camp David Accords, normalizing relations under which Israel handed back the Sinai Desert to Egypt, which is at the bottom of Gaza. Sadat was assassinated by hardline adherents to the Muslim Brotherhood in 1981. Israel and allies on the Christian minority in Lebanon expelled Arafat from Beirut in 1982 and presided over a massacre of Palestinians in 2 Beirut refugee camps, Sabra and Shatila. Then the amazing breakthrough in 1993, the Oslo Accords, after months of secret negotiations brokered by Norway, which, Robert, you will know, is a country very similar size to New Zealand and has a similar multilateral view. Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin shook hands on the White House lawn. Rabin was assassinated shortly after by an Israeli extremist, and in the process was finally the Oslo process, was killed more or less when Arafat unwisely backed Saddam Hussein over the Iraq War in 1991. Since then, 13 years of it under Netanyahu, Israel has built a containment surveillance state to control Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, controlling movement and all the while building more and more Jewish settlements in the occupied territories, fragmenting the already small parcel of land envisaged by Palestinians and the UN and Oslo Accords as a homeland. It's worth remembering that Gaza is not much bigger than Great Barrier Island. Israel is about the size of the Waikato, including Gaza and the occupied territories. The West Bank is much smaller than Taranaki. Palestinians in the occupied territories staged 2 intifadas in the 1990s, uprisings against Israeli control and occupation, creating chaos, bombings in major Israeli centers, and leading to the construction of walls to separate Palestinian and Jewish communities. In 2005, hardline PM Ariel Sharon withdrew military and civilian settlements from Gaza, handing it over to the independent Palestinian administration under the command of Arafat's PLO, the Fatah group. Hamas, a hardline offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, expelled Fatah and won elections to run Gaza. Hamas and Fatah face off, with Hamas running Gaza and Fatah, now known as the Palestinian Authority, running the occupied territories. That kind of leads us to now, where there's little progress. And then I say, we can do this. This is all part of my dissertation for you for my future degree that you're going to grant me, hopefully.
Sounds like A material, Peter.
Yeah, exactly. To his credit, Donald Trump, or really Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, created the Abraham Accords, a breakthrough agreement to normalize diplomatic relations between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco and Israel. Joe Biden has capitalized on that until now, with a bold attempt to get Saudi Arabia into that chain. Riyadh made an agreement with the Palestinians conditional on it normalizing relations with Israel, and Hamas has stepped in with the backing of Iran to effectively sabotage any possibility of an agreement, launching its attacks in southern Israel on October 7. And here we are. Do go ahead. Your turn.
Well, I couldn't possibly add to that, Peter. You left me speechless. Where do we go from here? Well, that's a really interesting question. I did, and I think you probably did, have a look at President Biden's nationwide address in the United States following his return from Israel, in which he said, amongst other things, that America was now fighting 2 major threats from Putin, and he drew parallels. Interestingly, he said that the common denominator between Putin and Hamas is they're both seeking to destroy liberal democracies, one being Ukraine, the other being Israel. What he left out of that equation was, of course, which is quite clear to many people, I think, is that America is quite admirably backing Ukrainians' bid for political self-determination in the face of an intended encroachment by an authoritarian government, but it has shown relatively little interest, despite a declaratory stance for a 2-state solution, in realizing the political self-determination of the Palestinians. And so I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that Mr. Biden's speech has not gone down particularly well amongst Palestinians. because they see Mr. Biden as paying lip service to a two-state solution. In substantive terms, really backing one side of the equation, and that particular leadership at the moment, Mr. Netanyahu, doesn't seem particularly interested in Palestinian statehood, and has probably gone to extraordinary lengths to deny it.
Yeah, because I think Robert, one of the things that I find so extraordinary, like I've had experience of Netanyahu, many years as a journalist, and watched him right since that 1991 Gulf War when Saddam was flicking Scud missiles across, and Netanyahu kind of made his career actually by putting on a gas mask on CNN Live and really dramatizing it. Not that it wasn't a terrible thing to happen, but he is almost, it seems to me, afraid of normalization as Hamas. There's a weird connection between somebody like Netanyahu who thinks only of his political survival, it seems to me, and Hamas, who want to destroy anything good.
Yes, I think that's true. But there's a question here which Bernard raised, I think, in earlier communications about America's position in the world. And I'm not sure, it's early days, but I'm not sure that Mr. Biden's response to this crisis has been sure-footed and in America's long-term interest. And what I mean by that is there's been signs of real discontent in the United States. 55 Democrats have indicated they do not go along with the line that America has, that Israel has the unreserved right to defense, if it includes effectively collective punishment.
Actually, Robert, could you just explain this issue of collective punishment, because I'm not sure people quite get what that really means.
Right. Let's just explain this.
I hope that's all right, everybody.
Basically, when the appalling Hamas attack occurred on Israel, Israel basically responded with a state of siege and cutting off water, fuel, and what else did they cut
Electricity.
off? Yep. To an already besieged. We should point out that the Gaza Strip has already been under a blockade for 17 years. That act meant that, by definition, people who are not involved in the terror attack, namely the Palestinian population, are effectively being punished for being on the territory from which the terrorists operated. There's no love amongst many Palestinians for Hamas. Hamas did win the democratic election that you alluded to in 2006, but they haven't had one since. And are
most unlikely to. But
yes, but the point is that what we've witnessed since then has been a massive bombardment of Gaza, which made little distinction in actual. I mean, what they're doing is dropping over 6,000 bombs in a complex, highly populated suburban area, and more than 3,000 Palestinian civilians have died, including close to 1,000 children. So I suppose, really,
based on the information,
we're saying,
based on the information from Palestinian authorities who are controlled by Hamas, all of that stuff, just with the various health warnings.
Not entirely. This is information that's coming out of Qatar and other Arab states, and who have no love for Hamas. I think what we do know is an intensive bombardments going on. A lot of people in Gaza have not had any food or water for close to 8 days. So when we hear this term collective punishment, I think we're referring to the fact that Israel is directing its efforts not just at Hamas, but the civilian population generally. That's the perception. And the president of Israel, not the prime minister, did indicate,
president,
that in his view, all Palestinians bore responsibility for the attacks that occurred, which is an extraordinary thing to say, because it would appear that if Mr. Netanyahu and his government were surprised and caught cold by the Hamas attack, same could be said for the Palestinian population as a whole, who seem to be absolutely stunned.
But
according
Robert,
to
under
journalists.
international law, what is the consequence or the sort of, because
Well, under
we
international
should do an
law-
entire session on collective punishment, genocide, what is and is not genocide, and what is war crimes.
Collective punishment, of course, was something used by the Nazis in the 30s, and would be not just the 30s during the Second World War. But the point to note here is there is laws of war where the culprits are supposed to be targeted, but not the civilian population. And interestingly, in his speech at the Oval Office, Mr. Biden said he had reminded Mr. Netanyahu that Israel must obey the laws of war. He was referring to the fact that innocent Palestinians must not be targeted. But you see, for outside observers, that looks a bit late in the day. And so this is a very polarizing, difficult issue. But, I cannot help thinking that Israel may have been better off in terms of international opinion to have declared war against Hamas and indicate that they would do everything possible to protect the Palestinian population, civilian population, while targeting Hamas, and not cutting off the civilian population from water, electricity, and food.
Bernard, you want to move in on the housing market in Gaza?
Not quite. No.
There's a lot less of it than there was at the beginning of the week.
Sadly.
Yep.
I wonder, Robert, how this conflict can be contained now, because the big concern is that Hezbollah in Lebanon will jump in, or that Iran will intervene in some way, or that Israel will do something preemptively against Iran. What are the next things to watch for? And in particular, I'm thinking of this ground invasion, which has been talked about, but I haven't quite seen it yet. I just wonder, how can it be contained?
Well, the ground invasion hasn't, as far as I know, occurred yet, and it looks like it's imminent. Iran has made threatening noises. The foreign minister indicated that if the situation continues to escalate, which if decoded means if Israel goes ahead with its ground offensive, then there could be a preemptive intervention by forces that Iran supports, which I think, again, decoded means Hezbollah, but it could mean Iran itself. So it's a very worrying situation at the moment, and it could easily escalate. Yes, and I think America is fully committed, by judging by Mr. Biden's statements, and if the situation escalates with, one of the ironies about this situation, of course, is that. In a sense, you get the feeling that Mr. Netanyahu has kind of played into the hands of those who want to escalate on the Iranian side.
As
and
have
that's
the Hamas
the worrying
people,
thing for me, that in a sense, if he makes good his pledge, no, you don't know he will, but if he makes good his pledge to reduce Gaza to rubble or desert, he said.
More rubble, yep.
And there's a lot of very controversial incidents happening on a daily basis. Witness the attack on the UN building and also the hospital, where there's been competing narratives about. It seems to me that this is a very explosive situation where I think the Iranians are totally cynical about the Palestinians. I don't think they care about the Palestinians, but they do have regional ambitions, and they do see the Palestinians as a possible vehicle for promoting those ambitions. And so they may believe that, if we just don't know, because this is all speculation, but we cannot rule out the possibility that a further escalation in Gaza will bring perhaps Hezbollah or
Yeah,
Iran.
and the difficulty, Robert, with Hezbollah is that they're now desperate to seem relevant.
Yeah.
And I we could do another. I was just looking at something about Lebanon today, and Lebanon really is a failed state, particularly after that explosion.
Yeah, which is a tragedy.
A couple of years ago. You wrote to me something this week after I sent you my my thing on spin-off, essentially declining my honorary degree because I was being too optimistic about the possibility that Biden would actually be holding Netanyahu by the testicles while hugging him, because the trouble is,
what a graphic image.
I think it's actually, I might even there was a very good piece in the Atlantic this week about the hug Bibi strategy, because Obama pushed Bibi away because he was an untrustworthy lying ratbag. Biden has reassured him of almost unlimited support, but we also know that Biden really cares about that normalization idea, as foreign as that might seem, as amazing as that might seem now. It took a Sharon to pull out of Gaza, it took a Menachem Begin to do the Camp David agreement, and it took a Yitzhak Shamir, he wouldn't have done anything. It took a Yitzhak Rabin to do the Oslo Accords. Is there even a sliver of light here that it can lead to something bolder if Biden does have that intent?
I think Mr. Biden may be hoping so. And don't forget, he's also mindful, and I'm not trying to sound too cynical here, but he is mindful he's facing election next year. And yeah, I mean, you're quite right when you say sometimes you have to be a bit of a hardliner to make quite dramatic concessions in situations like this. But there's been nothing in Mr. Netanyahu's track record that suggests that he's going to make those sort of concessions.
No.
And the other thing is, Mr. Netanyahu doesn't always play by American rules.
Exactly.
He's certainly happy to accept American support. But I think Mr. Biden is taking a calculated risk here.
A rather large risk as well. Did you see his announcement tonight saying he needs billions more from a Congress that is already it's a very risky strategy. And also, he sounded to me like about 300 years old in almost everything he said in Israel. It's really difficult. Josie, what are you thinking about this? I made an unkind joke about Kaka and Zealandia at the very beginning of this podcast.
Why do you do those dad jokes, Peter? Do you think they're going to make you
Because
friends?
I'm a dad. There's lots of dads.
Yeah. Let me tell you, those dad jokes don't work. Anyway, what do I think? I've read something recently, I think it was today, that the fact that Biden went, that Rishi Sunak's going, is maybe the reason why the ground offensive hasn't started yet. And so I think, and actually, Peter, I think your little summary of hope has some merit. That if Biden's visit has somehow delayed the ground offensive, which is a recipe for disaster, just as you outlined, Robert. I mean, what do they do if they win? I mean, they decapitate Hamas as the leadership of Gaza, and then what? And I think one of the messages that Biden managed to get across was, don't do what we did in Iraq. Don't muck it up, because
and he did, and that was an amazing acknowledgement, wasn't it?
Yeah, and you can militarily win, but you can't win, hearts and minds. It's just not going to work. So I think there's some merit in your analysis, Peter, that this might be perhaps the best hope we've ever had in the last 50 odd years of a two-state solution. Just one thing though, did you realise, you said Biden sounded about 300 years old. He last sat in an Israeli Prime Minister's office 50 years ago with Golda, the Prime Minister at the time.
Wow. How amazing.
Prime Minister at the time.
Well, also, there are only
quite incredible.
A US president has only gone into a country at war twice, and both of them were Biden. So I'm not saying 300 years old is bad. I would vote for a 300-year-old person rather than a 78-year-old Trump, but not that I have a vote in the US anymore.
Well,
but Josie, that's such an interesting question. So because that is a really interesting idea that they have delayed it, because Netanyahu tries to be a man of action, and he it is this kind of action is so grotesque.
But they're still building up on the border.
That they are, but also I think, I mean, I haven't seen any internal polling for Netanyahu's support, but the general analysis seems to be this isn't going to benefit him, actually, that he doesn't look tough and strong, and he's always managed to get by on that because it was such a spectacular failure of security that Hamas got a came across the border with no one noticing.
Yeah, but there is another interpretation here, Peter, and I'm not knocking the hopeful interpretation. I hope you're right, and that is that from an Arab perspective, Hamas's appalling terror attacks on Israel have effectively destroyed the normalization process with the Abraham Accords, or not destroyed it, but certainly harmed it. I mean, as we all know, that Mr. Biden wasn't able to meet with Mr. Abbas or the Jordanian leadership or that of the Egyptian leadership because they believe that America is wrong to give Israel a blanket support for what they see as the disproportionate retaliation. And so I'm not sure how much hope there is beyond a Western perspective. And from an Arab point of view, the other thing that concerns me is that America's credibility, I mean, vetoing the humanitarian pause resolution has caused a lot of anger around the world. And what has worked in Mr. Biden's favor is that Europe took a pretty similar line to the United States at the beginning of this crisis, which came as a bit of a surprise to many of us. Ursula von der Leyen really was quite fierce in her condemnation. The EU has been quite supportive of the Palestinians' quest for self-determination, although they've been reluctant to play an active hands-on role. But I mean, I hope the hopeful interpretation comes through. But from a Palestinian point of view, with their civilians in Gaza suffering, with the terrible unrest that's going on in the West Bank, a number of Palestinians have been killed in protests over the bombardment of Gaza. These people killed in the West Bank, and the Palestinian Authority seems to be losing control of the situation there. So there is also a gloomy outlook as well because.
Can I ask you an international law question? Because the collective responsibility you were talking about before. I mean, that's not recognised in any international law, right? That's not a rule of war.
No, but there are laws of war and just war and what's called disproportionate responses.
So proportionate response. But isn't one of the issues in Gaza, and one of the tragic issues, is that so the way that as I understand it, civilian deaths are measured, is that if civilians have been targeted or accidentally hit in an area, but if they're in a military area, so a hospital isn't a military area, of course, but if the problem we've got in Gaza is that this practice of Hamas sort of hiding in civilian areas, the international law bit of that gets a bit murky. That if you've got there have been cases where the headquarters of Hamas they have set up in a hospital as a way of protecting themselves under international law, I suppose. But then it becomes murky if you're targeting civilian areas, but you can justify it by saying it's a military base or something.
Yeah, there is enormous murkiness there, but I think it was from the outset, I think many international lawyers were very concerned that Israel was not specifically targeting Hamas and promising protection for
And
civilians. And they're asking, to ask 1.2
yes,
million.
I was just going to say, to move.
And even now, there's really hard bargaining
and
about
the weird historical
trucks
comparisons that brings up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Josie, may I ask you, both of you really, and Bernard, I find the way this is being played out in New Zealand in public quite difficult and uncomfortable. How do you think the media in New Zealand or New Zealand people can, because you've seen in the UK, you've seen in various places a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism, and also in the UK in particular, a tremendous rise in anti-Muslim slogans and behaviour. We've seen from the people in Christchurch that they've detected related to the mosque killings an increase in anti-Muslim activity. How can we deal with this remotely and also without holding every Jewish person in New Zealand responsible for the actions of Israel, or every Muslim person responsible for the actions of Hamas.
Bernard, are you? Oh, yeah. I mean, I think
You're the philosopher in this
it's really
group.
hard.
Seriously. Josie, you can own that one, please.
I'm
We'll start on
trying not to talk over everybody. Yes.
Gosh, don't worry,
yeah.
it's never been a problem for me.
Look, it's been really awful overseas. I mean, you've had stories in the UK where you've got Jewish schools that have either closed or they've got extra security, Jewish kids being told not to, to cover up their anything that identifies them as Jewish. And as you say, the opposite happens as well. And so how you avoid that, I think, is by having exactly the kind of little preview you just did then, Peter, where you go, right, let's have a look at the history of this. Let's have a look at how we've got here. What are the issues here? I think the last thing you do in a country like New Zealand, where we feel very far away from this and we feel quite ignorant of it, I think most people are just struggling to get their heads around it. The last thing you do is shut down debate about it. And I think there's a tendency in the media to go, oof, we're in New Zealand, we don't know enough, don't talk about it. But actually, then you suddenly get these random views like Israel are the colonizers, and you go, that's an ignorant statement to make. You can condemn powerful states at undermining the rights of another state, a poorer, smaller state next door, and the inability of the government of Benjamin Netanyahu to recognise a two-state solution. You can do all of that without using the C word, colonisation, because it just doesn't stack up historically. So you've got to keep talking about it, otherwise we're going to just have random views that come up that you can't then push back on, because a statement like that creates such unease and anger in one part of the community.
But we may be geographically distant, but we are definitely affected by what's happening. And we shouldn't assume, by the way, that there's a worrying polarization here that someone called David Rothkopf has alluded to
from the HRW.
Yeah, and he said at the moment in the United States, at least, he was referring to the US case, that he was saying that people sometimes who have been critical of Netanyahu are branded as racist and anti-Semitist and anti-Semite, and he said this is completely wrong. And it is a very polarizing situation, and you have to tread very carefully.
You mentioned, Peter, the podcast, The Rest is Politics, the Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. They did a really great interview with Yuval Hariri.
Yes, we talked about that last week when you failed to turn up. Yeah.
No.
Oh,
Peter.
Quit. Okay, now you got it. Right. I'm going to come back at you with a dad joke next week. You just wait. Yes. Yeah. There's a guinea fowl walking along the path right now, and it just goes, arr, 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 and it doesn't stop. So, Peter, we can all do bird comparisons. I've lost my train of thought.
I'm so glad you've been here since the beginning. But yeah, it was totally brilliant. And one of the other things that I thought about today, and I've thought about from the beginning, if you listen to
the point I was going to make about that was that
I was filling in the yawning silence.
Yeah. That was, I was thinking, watching the guinea fowl literally walk past me. It's so annoying. I thought he articulated really carefully and eloquently that he is a liberal centre left wing Jew in Israel who has fought against the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, as have reservists and soldiers in Israel who were protesting in huge numbers against this government. And the kibbutzes that were hit by Hamas, the tragedy of this is that they were liberal left-wing kibbutzes who, have, you talked about it last time, kite festivals between Gaza and Israel, and believe in peace. And, so it's possible, as you say, Robert, you've got to be able to criticise the government without it being anti-Semitic, but you have to also be very careful that you're not saying that the state of Israel doesn't have a right to exist and they're colonisers.
Yeah. Yeah.
No one. I don't think one should say that at all. And I think the tragedy of the situation at the moment is that we all know there's very good Palestinians and there's very good Israelis who want to work as people in both communities who see a future of two states living peacefully side by side. But unfortunately, at the moment, we're in a situation where extremists in both societies have got quite a lot of influence. And Hamas, I mean, most Palestinians hate Hamas.
Absolutely.
That they are widely disliked. But they have no control over their lives. They don't live in a democracy as such, and they spend most of their life trying to get enough food. 80% of civilians in Gaza are dependent on food aid.
And
Actually,
if I could just step in on this, because we are running out of time, unless everybody votes for another half hour. But as they did on Sunday, which was pretty amazing, thank you. The dynamism, as we all know, of Israeli democracy. One of the reasons that it's even more complicated than our MMP system is because you have the most incredibly dynamic democracy, arguments everywhere. It is an argumentative country and an argumentative people. And I think one of the great things that I've read and heard, and they're all available there, is this: the people of many of the people in those kibbutzim, some of the people who survived the awful attack on the concert, essentially say, we do not want this to be taken out on the people of Gaza. We want Netanyahu to go as soon as possible, but first there has to be defence. We have to re-establish defence. And one of the most remarkable ones was the diplomatic reporter from Haaretz, whose father rescued him and his family. His father was a former general, I think, in the IDF. Father turned up, volunteered, came and rescued them from their own strong room. And the reporter just said, I'm very grateful for my dad. Now I have to get on to criticising Netanyahu. It's a dynamic and open democracy, which Hamas is not.
And it's a democracy. It's the only big democracy in the region. We could end on a hopeful note. The election in Poland, which was quite remarkable and proves this is where the centre-right candidate Tusk, who was, of course, he was the EU. I can't remember what his role was at the EU, but he has beaten his party's civic platform.
You mean Tusk, rather?
Tusk,
I was going to say Musk. Musk and Tusk are rather two different people.
No, not Elon Musk. Tusk.
Donald Tusk.
I should be able to remember some. But my stepmother is Polish, and my step grandfather was a minister before the communists came in. He was a minister of construction in the government, and he had his construction company basically nationalised by the communists, and so they made him the Minister of Construction under the communists. And my stepmother was a political refugee in America, so she goes back to Poland regularly now, went back for this election, and she said it was amazing. Like she managed to vote. 73% turnout, huge turnout. That's a bigger turnout than after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there was a real push that proves that autocratic populism can be defeated. And the one thing I would say about this is, how did it happen? How did he manage to do this? And it's a coalition of a centre-right, centre-left party now, two parties, or three parties, I think, which shows that those in the centre can defeat populism. And the secret to it was a very strong local civic society. Local government and civic society maintained its links to the community, its communication, its delivery of services. So they managed to kind of have a fight back from the grassroots up, which I think is a really good lesson for any of us to learn about how you fight against populism. You devolve, you go as local as possible, and you work in the communities.
Let's also remember, Josie, and I think we know which, not that we have sides in this, but Law and Justice was democratically elected. There are a lot of Polish people who supported its views on abortion. It then also did and other things. It also did a brilliant job of tampering with the judiciary, tampering with the media. I was
going to say, it wasn't a free and fair election.
Yeah, well, to some extent, but I just think we have to be, because I was thinking about this today. I consider myself to be a lower P progressive, because progress is inevitable and essential in a sense that we don't, despite me being a dad and having dad jokes, I'm not static. But some people do prefer static, and they do prefer to go back to a period that may never have existed. So, I think that Tusk thing is so interesting, and I adore Poland, and it is, a beacon for me of many things. But, a lot of people still voted. I mean, Law and Justice was still the biggest party in that election.
35%, you're right. And Tusk's party, Civil Platform, got about 30%, but under the system they can form a government. And you're right. I mean, you could say the same about Donald Trump too, Peter. And I would. And I have family members in the States who voted for Donald Trump, and I still love them.
Christ, some of the ones here voted for Winston, and you've got some very odd family. Actually, that's not true. We all do, and I do too.
Downwardly mobile.
It'd be interesting to know whether Poland
working class.
had implications for Hungary.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
but then we just got Slovakia. Now, people want to go on a couple of more minutes or a bit more, and to have less of me. Apparently, I'm just going to tell them to go away, because apparently there are 9-year-olds listening to this. Now, Bernard, they want some information about New Zealand. Now, I thought Patrick Smelly wrote a brilliant piece, because I was yelling at the radio yesterday with the use of this word "secret" to describe the coalition talks, which essentially a private would have been a much better word.
Yeah,
Josie and Bernard, this is your patch.
Yeah. I'll finish off with this, which is to say that this is what happens during the middle of summer, when not much is happening. Sometimes the media jumps in and fills it with smoke, and in this case, it's a horrible situation, because I've been there in Parliament where you have this interregnum between the election and the actual formation of the government, where understandably parties, they haven't had the negotiation yet. They don't really know what chips they've got to play with, because they don't have the final results from the specials, and they do change. So in the meantime, you've got journalists doorstepping people at the airport, outside the front door of Parliament, and it all gets a bit silly. And so sometimes I think we should have like a period after an election and before.
We're going to Purda after the election rather than before the budget. That's a very good
idea. So
yeah.
So immediately, after the initial results are declared, and then we'll go away on holiday for like 3 weeks. And the beginning of the start of the discussion is when the specials are counted on November the 3rd.
That's a very good idea.
We all come back from a long holiday, because we deserve it after a tough campaign, and then we start reporting again, and we avoid all this nuttiness in the middle.
Josie, what do you think's going on here?
Yeah, I totally agree, Bernard. It's ridiculous, really. And I think actually Christopher Luxon has managed to look quite statesman-like during this, because it's a different situation. You haven't got in the past we've had Winston Peters, who we're waiting to see who he's picking, and he's the one who's calling all the shots, and so he's the one that the media are going after, whereas this Christopher Luxon just keeps saying, I'm not going to talk about this in public until we've talked about it privately. So, and I think most of us, even I'm sick of it. I can't. It's 2 weeks of this to go before the special votes get counted. So we've got like about, 560,000 or something special votes, of which only 15% are overseas votes. So the chances are, the most likely scenario is that National will lose a seat. But the interesting thing I think about doing the numbers is National's kind of a victim of its own success, really. It's won 50 seats. 50 seats in Parliament, of which 45 are electorates, which means that there's only, I think about, 5 on their list who've got in. So if they do well in the specials, they're going to possibly lose the likes of Jerry Brownlee. If they lose some seats, that'll actually be quite good for them on the list, at least, because they'll get people, good people like Agnes Lohini, who's a very strong Pacific advocate in the National Party. They really want people like James Christmas, who's a lawyer. They had him tagged to go straight into cabinet as I think treaty minister. So yeah, it's interesting to watch how it all falls out. But we've got 2 weeks till the specials, and I don't think I can talk about it for another 2 weeks. You're right.
No. So what just to end on, I think I wanted to congratulate you, Josie, for your column this week, which actually looked at the issue of quality of government spending and how a new national-led government is actually going to improve it, and went to the the extent, and this is where I wanted to tie it all together, of talking about allowing people closer to the local level to make decisions. And you mentioned the Polish result and how actually having devolved power was a good thing. And one of the mistakes I think Labour have made over the last 6 years is to do a lot of centralisation and to take some of those decisions away from the grassroots and from smaller towns and cities. And people felt like it was being centralised in Wellington. And I think if National are going to win some of those regions back properly, and also a lot of provincial towns, they need to avoid the centralisation instinct, which is very strong in Wellington, and National's been guilty of it as well in the past, I think.
What do we? So this is going to go. I've got to go and cook dinner for some people shortly because
we don't care,
to
Peter. We don't
What?
care. We don't care, and we don't want to know that.
Yes, you do. You're going to come round to dinner at my house, I hope, soon, sometime, because I know you never come north of Wairarapa, but you know.
No, we really want Josie to come up, and
We do.
and Robert. At
Yeah.
one
Funny
point,
enough,
we
I
are
was
going
thinking
to be
about
all
another
in the
event.
same place.
Is this the December?
Well, yes, and
Yeah.
a friend of
Live
mine was
food,
just saying maybe we should do it on a cruise. But if some of the people who've been rude to me today came, I'd push them off the boat. What do we think of the managerial approach that we keep hearing about of Chris Luxon's, that he wants to be a sort of Prime Minister Chief Executive? Is that going to fly, Josie?
No, but I think if he can do a sort of John Key and get the best out of his ministers, then that's presumably what he means by I'm used to getting the best out of my team. I'm a good manager. Fine, but Bernard, I think you're spot on. That I think they've really got to have some big ideas. We didn't see any big ideas in the campaign from either party, and that's part of the problem. And one of those is devolution. And you're right, Labor was far too centralised. I think devolution is a really lefty idea, but in New Zealand it's been captured by the right. Bill English was very committed to devolution, to targeted social investment in communities and devolving away from Wellington bureaucracy. So it's interesting that in other countries it's the opposite. It's a left issue. But I think given their vulnerability around treaty stuff, that they look like a bunch of white guys in blue suits at the moment, even though that's not fair representation of the entire caucus, I know. But if they want to, they've got to have some big ideas about how they devolve to Māori communities, to local community, to community generally. If they can keep that Bill English idea going, if they can bring that back and kind of double down on it, I think that we'll look at them and go, okay, so you are actually doing things differently, and you are prepared to share power with community groups, and that includes Māori and iwi organisations too.
Do they have to abandon, Josie, the Act Treaty referendum?
Absolutely. Can you imagine how divisive that would be?
Yep.
Look at the voice. You talked about it eloquently, Peter. There's a compliment.
Jesus, steady on.
Sweet.
Don't expect one back.
Oh, go and make your
No,
dinner.
we definitely need to have a few more gins and tonics, I think, and all in the same place.
Yeah.
And what are you drinking, Bernard? You're drinking something with
Well,
ice
actually,
in it. I hope it's just water.
I know, but it's actually just water. Yeah.
Oh, how boring. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's
Hey,
it's what?
I too am going to have to head off to the.
Well,
6
now
o'clock
let me just do
news
the
or whatever it is.
skateboarding dog then, because
Oh,
the skateboarding dog
one
story
skateboarding
comes from
dog.
Poland.
Thank you.
And I am going to tell somebody on our readership to fuck off in a minute, but sorry to the 9-year-old. The skateboarding dog story is the fantastic one of the Polish shoplifter who snuck into a department store and hid in the front window of the department store pretending to be a mannequin.
Brilliant.
Exactly, and he managed to stay in there after closing time, go around, steal a whole bunch of things, including jewellery, and then leave.
He deserves it.
I think he deserves it. And then it said there was he also had done it previously, going into a shopping centre just after it had closed and eating everything in the food hall.
Go to Coles.
His
to
luck
Coles.
his luck finally ran out when he was spotted and held by security. But the picture on The Guardian is fantastic. He was a 22-year-old accused of stealing jewellery after posing as a display dummy. He was a real dummy and not just a mannequin. Goodbye.
No.
It's enough dead
Hey,
jokes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Have
guys.
great
Have a
weekends.
great
Thank you.
weekend.
Cheers.
See you,
Thank
Josie.
you.
You are totally
Bye-bye.
fabulous.
Bye.
Bye bye.
You were terrible.
That's enough. Good stuff.
Very funny.
Thank you. Alrighty. Catch ya. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Are we all...